Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done.
Chris is quite right. This is the third of 3 times that we have read the same passage. And is that because we're unimaginative? No. It's because this theme of what it means to be made in God's image is absolutely loaded. It's absolutely loaded. 3 Sundays is not enough, but we will be moving on after this morning. But let me take you up in the air, if you don't mind. Up in the air is a picture on the screen of a series that you can watch on National Geographic, which I think has a paywall now of Disney Plus in front of it. But if you were to watch the season or the series, 1, 2, I think it's 3, of Europe from above, you would just see loads and loads of drone footage. There's a voiceover that's very telling from a chap that was in the Mighty Boosh, but that's another story for another day. But Europe from the air, it just tells you how beautiful Europe is. You go to a city, you choose your poison, you go to Paris, that's as good as my French gets, other than Monge 2 and Del Boy. But you go to Paris, you go to Brussels, you go to Rome, and you're walking around and you see this is a pretty amazing city to walk around. But then if you see it from the air, you see how it fits together. You see different perspectives, different vistas and so on, because drones have changed how we view the world. Now, we're going to do something similar this morning. For the last 2 weeks, we've looked at work and rest, ground level view of what it means to be made in God's image. It changes how you view your work and why you work, and it means that you can rest. We also looked at relationship on the ground level. To be made in God's image means we are made for relationships with him, with other people who are different from us. But now we're going to jump in our drone, so to speak, in our mind's eye, and we're going to come out of ground level and we're going to think about something in terms of worth and value and dignity, because being made in God's image means we have a lot to understand about worth and dignity and value. To be made in God's image is applicable to all of life. And what we've seen in these last 2 Sundays, and God willing this morning, is just the beginning of a journey that the rest of the Bible unpacks what it means to be made in God's image. So point number 1, why is it so important that we grasp and steep our minds and reflect for a third time what it means to be made in God's image? Well, here we go. I've got 4 points under this, and you say, hang on, you always have 3. Well, I'm just going to mess with you. We've got 4 implications this morning under point 1 of the importance of being made in God's image. What does it mean to be made in God's image, to be made in his likeness? 4 implications of why it's so important that we wrestle with this topic again. Number 1, it helps us understand self-image. It helps us understand self-image. The Bible says no matter who you are, no matter where you are from, no matter what you've done, no matter how low you've got at whatever point in your life that you look back to, every human being has been made in the image of God. And therefore, there is a rock solid, certain definition of every individual's value and worth and dignity. There is an objective outside of ourselves view that every human being has an irreducible significance that nothing and no one can take away. So that's just the first one we're throwing to think about. Every human being has a God-given worth and dignity and value. Now, why is that so important to think about? Because if we take away God that we thought about in chapter 1, what difference does that make? It makes an awful lot of difference. If you take away God and have a solely scientific and a secular viewpoint, then human beings have no value and worth and dignity. G.K. Chesterton wrote this rather sardonically. As a politician, the secular person will cry out that all war is the waste of life. And then, as a philosopher, admit that all life is a waste of time. The secular person goes first into a political meeting where he complains the natives are being treated as if they were beasts. Then he goes to a scientific meeting where he proves that all human beings actually are beasts. You can't have it both ways. If you take God out of the picture, then humans have no dignity, worth, or value. They're just a bag of cells caused by an accident. Christianity says the doctrine of the image of God, what the Bible teaches about men and women, boys and girls being made in God's image, is grounded not in a political viewpoint, not in a philosopher's best guess. Every human being is made in God's image, so they have worth, dignity, value, no matter what they look like. Friends, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you've done, you are valuable to God. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28, point number 2. The second implication, if that's every individual's worth, then it really matters how you treat other people. See the implication? It matters how you treat other people who cross your path. Have you thought about money recently? Money, one of the main things that money does, it gives you choices. If you have less money or no money, you don't have any choices. If you have money, you can choose between car or bus. If you have money, you can choose between transport, where you live, what postcode you choose to live in, what street you call home. You can choose where you send your kids to school or no school. There's so many opportunities that you have when you have money. You choose who you mix with. You can say, I don't want to be with that person because they're dirty. I don't want to sit next to them because they're difficult or because they're demanding. Money gives us an opportunity to classify who we are and who we want to be with and who we want to rub shoulders with. We mentioned this in our life group on Wednesday evening. C.S. Lewis wrote a famous sermon called The Weight of Glory. And in it, he's reflecting on what it means to be made in God's image. This is what he says. There are no ordinary people. It is immortals whom we joke with, work with. And then he says this. The weight of your neighbour's glory is a burden you should put on your back every day, and only humility will carry it. What does he mean? Every single person who crosses your path, the ones who are difficult, the ones who are easy, the ones who smell lovely and the ones who just smell, the ones who you think will add value to your career path trajectory, and the ones that will get in your way. If everybody's made in God's image, that means you don't write anybody off. If everybody has intimate value, then they need to be treated with dignity by you and kindness by you. They deserve your respect. They deserve concern. You never write someone off. Everybody deserves grace. Everybody deserves gentleness and to be treated with respect and even reverence. Why? Because they're made in God's image. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28. So let me ask you a question. Do you treat people like that? Because I don't. And I need God's help to do it Here's the third implication. Let's get bigger, up in the drone again, getting more remote. What about civil rights? If people are made in God's image, so everybody who crosses your path, you need to treat with dignity and respect. What about rights? Regardless of class or race, you cannot trample on another individual because they have rights. Why? Because they're made in God's image. There's a man called Brian Triany. He was a professor in the medieval age and church history. He made it his life's work to prove that the values we hold as common and that we are trampling on in the modern age actually come right from the Bible. They made their way into law, and now they are owned by vast pieces of the world. He says, you might want to flick forward to Genesis chapter 9, verse 5 to 6. Genesis 9, 5 to 6, God says this: "From each man I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. For in the image of God has God made man." Now, what does he say? He does not say, you need to keep the law and don't break the law. What he says is this: I made human beings in my image. That's what's more important even than the law of your land. Every human being is made in God's image, and therefore every human being has rights and worth and dignity. That's where the idea came from Genesis chapter 1, chapter 9, and it's modeled throughout the Bible that every person made in God's image has worth and rights. Fourthly, what happens therefore by implication, if we're made in the image of God, if we bear his likeness, when a society that got its idea of human rights from a belief that all people are created equal and in God's image, what happens when it loses the idea of God? What happens when it becomes secular? Now let me take you to the flower pot. There's a picture on the screen. I don't know the last time you bought someone you love flowers. If you can't remember, maybe you should do it again. But as soon as you buy flowers, roses, a bunch of roses that are chopped off, they are dying. You're buying a product that is dead, on its way to dying completely, dead. So perhaps when you're at M&S or at the flower store, perhaps you should try and haggle a bit more with the flower seller and say, I'm buying a dead product, I want to take some money off. So there you go. But here's the point. As soon as you chop off the rose from the source, you're buying a product that is dying. And you buy it from Aldi or M&S or wherever you go. And you hope it's true that it will last for 7 days. But unless new life is given to it, it will die. It's just a matter of time. People have said we're in a hypocritical time in Western culture. We're living in a cut flower culture. And so when you want to keep the values that God has given to us through the Bible, and yet you want to ignore God, very soon those values will die out, just like a bunch of flowers you buy for someone you love. The dying process has begun. And when we get rid of God, and yet we want to keep morality, and we want to keep dignity for individuals, especially the vulnerable in society, on what basis do those values come from if we say God no longer exists? We can't negotiate. It's all or nothing. And if God is real, then people have inherent value. If God is removed, on what basis do we say people have value and morality? It's a question we've got to grapple with, and we've been grappling with it for many, many decades. If we don't believe in God, if we don't believe people are made in the image of God, on what basis do human rights have protection? This is how we've sought to do it in society. We've said, if God is removed, then it has to be on the capacity people have to do certain things. It's about the capacity people have. People deserve, God doesn't exist. Therefore, it's the capacity that people have to morally process right and wrong. It's the capacity people have to be self-conscious, to reason, to make moral choices. And that alone means they are worthy of protection. But when we think of the implications of that, by implication, therefore, babies that are in wombs have no capacity to prove right from wrong. They can't make moral choices. They don't know their left hand from their right hand. They can't live apart from their mother. They do not have capacity, and therefore they do not have rights, and therefore they can be disposed of. And yet it's not just the child in the womb. It's also babies that are born. Infants do not have those capacities either. They can't reason, but they've been given birth to. They have no preferences yet, and they can't make moral choices. But it's not just them as well. What about children or adults with disabilities, profound disabilities? And they don't have capacity either. And then what about the elderly? They lose capacity. That's the logical steps we make as a society when God is removed. It's called a cut flower society. Now you can see why we need to spend 3 weeks on this. But here's something we need to understand. When the church was born into the Greco-Roman world, exactly the same problems existed then as today. Rights and capacities. There's Aristotle, he wrote these words. There are some races that are too emotional. They're too emotional. They can't reason, and because they can't reason for higher capacity, let's make them slaves, said Aristotle. And so you have slavery in the Greco-Roman world, you have terrible poverty, you had abortion in the Greco-Roman world, it was very, very dangerous. You had infanticide, that means children were thrown out on the streets if you didn't want them. The elderly, the sick and poor were just left to die. It was a brutal society, and yet it was illegal then, and it was done all the time. And then the Christians came along. And the Christians came along and said, this is not right. Men and women, boys and girls, regardless of their age and stage of life, are made in God's image. And therefore everybody has worth and dignity. And the church came into existence, and the church, Christians, because of what Genesis 1, 26 to 28 says, we're made in God's image, in God's likeness, they were the champions. They were the champions on behalf of women who had no rights. They were the champions of those who were orphans. They were champions of the weak and the lowly. They were champions of the poor, and they were against abortion. And they put the rest of the culture to shame because they believed in the sanctity of human life. And the whole Western world adopted the idea of the image of God because of the church. Friends, when you believe in the image of God, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28, the circle of protected life expands. It expands, it grows. But if you do not believe in the image of God, if you only believe in capacities or have a similar approach to understand worth and dignity and value, the circle will continually contract and get smaller and smaller, and fewer people are protected. Do you see how important it is to understand what the image of God means? Now let's move on, but only after we've thought about a few applications. The other 2 points are far shorter. Be encouraged. What would it look like for us as Emmanuel Epsom if we took this seriously? What would change if we took the image of God seriously? Here's some thoughts. Firstly, we would be passionate about the rights of unborn children. We would want to get involved. We would want to have a voice to protect the rights of unborn children. Secondly, we would offer grace to everybody. We would offer grace to everybody, to women who have had abortions. We would offer grace to them. To men and women who've helped people have abortions. We would give grace to them. Grace to everybody. Thirdly, we'd be all for the poor, all for the weak, all for the marginal, all for the vulnerable. In short, we would be a very, very unusual community. Wouldn't we? Why don't we be a very unusual community? And have God's passion for the needy and the weak and the lowly. What is stopping us caring for people just like that? The Bible says it's because we're made in the image of God, and it's broken in you and me, and because it's broken in you and me, that is why we don't honour other people as we should. But what does that mean? That's the importance of the image of God. Here's the second point. Here's the meaning of the image of God. Here's the meaning of the image of God. Verse 26 again from Genesis 1, please. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Now, what does it mean to be made in the image? Chris's little word to the kids was excellent. It means two things. You saw a mirror on your way in, I hope, on our welcome desk. Two R words, please. Reflection, and representation. I wonder if you've been down to Salisbury Cathedral, perhaps during the week or on a Saturday. If you go down to Salisbury Cathedral, there is the most wonderful reflecting pool. So you look into it, it's a great piece of sculpture, and when you look in it, you see the beauty of the vaulted ceiling, and you see the intricacy of the stained glass window. Salisbury Cathedral. Or you might want to go up to the banqueting hall in London. If you go up to the banqueting hall in London, you get asked if you'd like a hand mirror that's about A4 size, and then you can look into the mirror, and you can look up at the ceiling, and then you'll bump into someone else as you're spending so much attention looking at Rubens' masterpiece on the ceiling of the banqueting hall in central London. What God is saying in these sentences is something like that. To be made in God's image is to represent him and to reflect his character. I've made you to be human, mirror-like people. That as you gaze at me, you will reflect who I am. And if you don't look at me, you reflect my image less. That's the reality of it. I've created you as human beings to mirror, to reflect my glory, my goodness, my love, my character. You have intimate potential to reflect my character because you are made in my image. But to do that, we actually have to face God with our souls. We have to look towards God with our souls, direct our hearts towards him in his word to understand his priorities. And then when we do that, we will bring flourishing and life and protection to the world in which God has placed us. Now, how does that work? Back to these two sentences again. Genesis 1, 26 to 28. Look at the verbs here. Fruitful, be fruitful, fill, subdue, rule. I want you to face me so that my character is reproduced in you. Then all life will flourish around you. Now, how's that going to work? Firstly, we are deeply relational beings. We thought about this last week, and that's the reason it's in community, not just listening to podcasts of messages. It's in community, it's in the church that you're changed as the rough edges get knocked off and as the sandpaper of relationship is used by God's Spirit in our lives. Secondly, we're also spiritually dependent people. Let's go back to the idea of a mirror. If we're made in God's image like a mirror cannot be its own source of light. Back to secondary school and physics. It has to have a light source, and then it illuminates the object. So we cannot be our own source of light. Mirrors can't produce their own light. And so our worth and our significance comes when our hearts and souls are faced towards the source of light and source of life, that is King Jesus. It's about glory and worth and significance. If we don't have our heart's posture towards God's glory, we will be towards something else, because we have to find a means of significance and worth. We're made in the image of God to represent him, to reflect his glory, and therefore, if it's not towards him, what will it be? Where will our value and worth and sense of beauty and sense of significance come from outside of ourselves? Because it can't come from within. God's made us as spiritually dependent creatures, dependent upon him. And if you don't look to him with the posture of our heart, with our souls directed towards him, our beauty and significance and worth will come from something else. It could come from human approval. That's where I go to check in that I'm okay. It could be our workplace again. It could be our family. It could be all things like that. Somewhere where I know that if I have this, if that's the goal of my heart, I will be proved enough. I will have a sense of dignity and value. But here's the thing, we cannot generate it ourselves. So from where will our heart be pointed to mirror the worth of that thing, the worth of that object? You can't generate it yourself. We've broken the image of God in ourselves, and because of that, we're going to trample on anyone who gets in our way. It's the importance and the meaning. So what can be done about that? If we've broken the image of God in our hearts, if we trample it, the image of God in other people, what can be done? It's the wrong question to ask. Rather, what has God done? It's the better question to ask. What has God done to repair the damage that we have caused because of our sin? Point number 3. This is God's ultimate repair job. How has God repaired the image of God? Here are 3 parts of the Bible to think about. Colossians 1 is on the screen. Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God. It literally says icon. You look at Jesus, you see God's beauty. John 14, verse 9, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you look at Jesus, you see the real beauty and worth of God fully on display. And then here's the third one, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 15. Paul is talking to a church, people who know the Bible, but people who don't understand the gospel. They don't see that it points to Jesus. They don't see that there's a veil over their hearts and minds, so they cannot see that the Bible is all about Jesus. They don't understand that Jesus died for their sins. And so there's a veil over their hearts. And this is what Paul has written. Now to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covered their hearts. But when anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. And we, who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his likeness and image from one degree of splendor to the next. What's Paul talking about? I think he's raising a question. What is going to attract my soul and your soul back to God? When we look to other things for significance and worth and dignity, what will turn our hearts back so we focus on nothing else other than Jesus? What will grab our affections of our heart so that we look to Jesus wholly and solely? It's not enough to say, oh, I've made God the center of my life. It's a New Year's resolution. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go to this place. I'm going to give more. I'm going to read more. I'm going to listen more and serve more. Something has to attract you back. And here's Paul saying, this is how you read the Bible and discern the gospel of Jesus. If you see what he's done, if you see that he was willing to die for you, if you see and sense the worth, the history dividing priority of the cross of Jesus Christ, it has potential to transform you into his likeness, and nothing else can. The cross of Jesus was the greatest victory of God, and it has the power of God for salvation. And as you gaze, as you turn your heart to mirror and reflect on the glory of God in the face of Jesus, you see the beauty of God. And that alone has power to repair the image of God in you. It's the only thing that can. As you reflect on the power of God in the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ for the sins of the world, as you gaze on the image of Christ, that fixes God's image in me. And that means I will treat other people with dignity. I will give them the worth that they deserve. I'll be passionate about the priorities of God, and I'll stop trampling on the image of God in other people because of Jesus. How does that work? Well, remember, friends, that Jesus was homeless. Do you remember that in the early days of his life? Do you remember that he was almost killed when he was a baby? He was an outsider. Do you remember that Jesus was poor? When he died, he had one possession, which was his garment. You know that he was tortured brutally. You know that he was a victim of injustice and experienced the power of the crowd, even though he was the only perfect image of God who's ever walked the earth. He was utterly trampled upon and like a piece of paper ripped apart. And why did he do that? Why was he willing to pay the penalty for our sins? Because he chose to out of love, for the glory of his Father. When I see that more than anything else, I see the beauty of God in history. I see a holiness so holy, Jesus had to come and die for us because no one else could. That's how sinful I am. But I see a love that's so loving, he was glad to do it. He was glad to do it. When I see that, I'm gazing, I'm sensing, I'm savoring the sacrificial death of Jesus and all the implications of that. Jesus Christ, the only perfect man, the perfect representation, the icon of God. I see the glory and beauty of God, and I see it nowhere else other than the cross of Jesus. And that begins to change me and turn me into a mirror. A mirror. I mirror my soul back toward him, and all these other things. I begin to see in me a healing of the image of God that I've broken because of sin. I begin to center on him more and more. I begin to image him more and more, and that heals God's image in me. And I want to see healing of God's image in the world. You are in the image of God. You're surrounded by the people made in the image of God. All of the people you don't know, and even if you don't like the person sat next to you, they're made in God's image. They're made in God's image. Let's act like it. And let's pray about it.